Hello and welcome. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute recently published a paper talking about discrimination in our society and discrimination in the access to education institutions. David Wand was the author of that, and he joins me right now from Halifax. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for doing that paper. And let's just tell our audience what it's all about, because when I say racial discrimination, some people say, oh, discrimination against minorities. That's not what you found.
I didn't find that at all, but we'll get into it a bit later. But what I did was I looked at 18 law schools and 14 medical schools across the country, and I asked them. I noticed on their websites, you don't have to ask me, you'll see on their websites that they racially segregate the applicants. They ask the applicants to self-identify as either Black, Indigenous, other racial minority, and if you don't get into those three groups, the school will call you something else like white or regular or whatever. And so I asked 18 law schools, give me your data by race, their grades, their LSAT scores, and their MCAT scores. And for the 14 medical schools, I also made the same request. Oddly, only 6 law schools gave me the data, 7 medical schools gave me the data. So that's 19 schools that refused to give me their race-based data, even though it's on their websites that they're asking applicants to racially self-identify.
So much for transparency. But these schools are having that policy of their own accord. To your knowledge, and it's to my knowledge, this is not an elected government telling them to have this policy.
That's correct. Now, there's a bit of hope going on. Ontario Bill 33 is trying to ban race from the admissions process, but we'll talk about that later. But if you want me to get into the data, I'm happy to do so. What would you like me to do first?
Well, I'd like you to give the results, which is that overall, just
Sure.
generalization is that there is racial discrimination. And in many cases, if you're, as I told U of T, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, that I am a straight white male, and they wanted nothing to do with my donation money. Anyway, but you go ahead, tell us your results.
It's interesting. Okay, I'll give you one example, then I'll give you the summary. So if you look at McMaster University Medical School, their 2024 first year class, they have 217 spots. So if you just rank the top grades of the top 217 that apply by race and also top MCAT scores, you'll find that they should be letting in all 217 should be non-Black, non-Indigenous applicants, but they didn't do that. Instead, they let in 14 Black applicants, even though their grades and MCAT scores were below the top 217 spots, and they let in 3 Indigenous. So that's just one example. So if you add up all the spots in all the medical schools and law schools across the country, there's 2,150 spots, but 216 of them, about 10%, were given to racial minority applicants, even though their grades fell below the top 2,150 rankings, right? If you repeat that for the MCAT and the LSAT scores, about 6%, 132 of the students were let in, admitted to the school, were racial minority applicants, but they shouldn't have been let in because their MCAT and their LSAT scores were below the top ranks. And no whites or non-Black Indigenous were, for grades, admitted to the school with lower grades. But there were 6 whites, not 132 racial minority, but in addition, 6 whites, 2 UNB Law, University of New Brunswick, and 4 University of Saskatchewan Law that were let in, even though their LSAT scores were below the top ranked scores. So there's clearly racism going on. And what's even more interesting is, in my opinion, is there's even racism going on between the 3 racial minority groups. So Blacks versus Indigenous versus other racial minority were also being denied admission, even though their LSAT or MCAT or grades were greater than the other racial minority group. I can give you one example if you want to hear it, or do you want me to stop right there?
Well, no, I want that in a while, but let me just ask you then. So, the conclusion I draw from your research is that there are qualified people who, but for their race, would be in law school or in medical school. And there are unqualified people who are being pushed through the system. Now, somebody may say, okay, but in order to rectify some past prejudices, some past errors. We need some policy, but it seems to me that maybe, okay, fine, put aside 5, put aside 10, but not deny a whole race to be there. But I have to take a quick break. You can think of the answer to that, David. I'll be right back after this. And we're talking about reverse discrimination. David Wan is a researcher in Halifax. He joins us from Halifax, and he has done an important paper from law schools and medical schools talking about the fact that people are being admitted to those schools who, on the basis, I guess, of academic standing alone, would not be in those schools. Is that right, David?
Correct. If you just rank the top LSAT, MCAT scores and their grades, they shouldn't be admitted on those bases, but they are still being admitted because they're a racial minority.
And I know from personal experience that at the University of Toronto, not just with law schools or medical schools, they advertise for employees who are of a certain, who are black or they're something else. Doesn't matter, as long as they're not white. If you're white, you're toast. So how is this reflective of the students graduating? Did you get a chance to do any research on that, or do you have any speculation as to that? Because they're having people in the schools who are not qualified.
Right. Can only speculate. I don't have the data, and it would be interesting to look at that data, to look at the, for example, the performance on their licensing exams as physicians or lawyers, and correlate that back to their LSAT and their MCAT scores and their grades. But I was only looking at the admissions point, so I couldn't really look
Okay,
at
well,
that.
let me put something to you then, David, for future research, because at the Law Society of Upper Canada, they had a number of graduates of schools who would not otherwise have been allowed into law school. They were pushed through law school. They graduated. They were pushed to graduate. In other words, I'm saying they would not have otherwise graduated. And then when they came up to the Law Society exams, they failed. And then the Law Society said, well, we're going to make you lawyers anyway. Now, with if you're, we don't have capital punishment, so you're not going to lose your life on that. You may lose your license or lose something else. But if that happened in medical school, I would be darned if I wanted someone performing a heart surgery on me who was only there above me with a scalpel because he was non-white.
So I don't know if you're going to get into this, but there is a better way of dealing with past racial injustices without discriminating against white applicants or non-black, non-indigenous applicants. Well, if you look at even more progressive, liberal NDP-led governments, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, it's in my study, they ban race from the application process at their universities. But they also, being very progressive countries, being multiracial country, just like Canada, they have introduced programs before they apply to medical school or law school to deal with the tools and the access issues that you need to be a high performing undergraduate student to get into medical school or law school. Roland Fryer is a black economist at Harvard, same issue, same approach. He says blacks are not performing as well on these LSAT or MCATs or SATs to get into university. So what I'm going to do is, research indicates, we've got to bring in access for racial minority groups before they apply. In primary school, he identified after school tutoring and poor quality teaching. So one of the key factors of reducing that performance gap is monitoring teacher performance, getting the teachers in primary school better performers in delivering the curriculum.
So, David,
so
you've done this research on the United States and other countries, and then based on your research, Canada is a laggard. We are not doing the right things.
Because these are law schools, they know better. Unfortunately, in Canada, reverse racism is legally protected, Section 15, subsection 2 of the Charter. So that's the problem. They know that if the 4,000 applicants to McMaster that got a higher MCAT score than the black that they let in from my data, if they sue them, they will lose because of subsection 2 of the Charter. And the law schools know that. That's why they're being racist, because they know they can get away with it, right? So that's the problem right there. And the second problem, in my opinion, is we don't have what all these other countries I listed have. We do not have proportional representation. So you get these single political parties that have absolute power that can pander to these racial minorities for votes. And so you've got this awful polarization going on. While in these Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, they have at least two political parties that form the majority government. And they have, they have negotiation going on if there are competing interests. But we've got this awful pandering, as Andrew Coyne will tell you, is
Now,
going on.
now, you know what, David? I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to thank you, first of all, for doing that research, for coming on the show, and you bring in proportional representation. And Andrew Coyne, we're going to have another show on that because proportional representation would be a disaster for Canada. But the time is up. David, thank you very much. Lovely chatting. Okay, so we're going to be right back after this with another subject. Not as incendiary as that one, but it's a very good one. Welcome back. Now we're going from Halifax in one part of the country over to Vancouver. We're joined by Alexander Brown in Vancouver, who is the editor of Without Diminishment. And if you know about it, you know that it's a fabulous publication. If you don't know about it, Alexander, welcome to the show. And why don't you tell our viewers what is Without Diminishment?
Stephen, thank you so much. It's a great honor, and it was a great honor to sit down with you a few days ago as well. Without Diminishment is a publication that I keep describing as conservative, but you have rightly told me, well, why is it conservative if these ideas are just common sense?
So it's a publication that talks about, in your words, some new ideas for Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, or new ideas that I wish didn't feel new, but maybe are new, coming out of a window of a few years that were perhaps destructive civilizationally, in our discourse, where we are really trying to thoughtfully examine first principles, the role of Western civilization, of to build and defend our monuments of meaning, to speak proudly about Canadian heritage and culture, to have proactive discussions.
Let me stop you right there. Canadian culture, I get that, even though we had a prime minister who said we're the first non-culture Canada, really, but non-nationalistic. But when you say first principles, what are you referring to?
I am referring to what some people call the true, the good, and the beautiful. I have grown tired of abdications on basic truths in our culture, on crime, on being able to. We need to be able to acknowledge that there are things that are not working, that there were things that always worked, that Western civilization was a net good for all and for this great country, and that we had some great decades before we started calling ourselves post-national and pulling everything down. And so this is so much of what we're trying to do editorially framing is like a thoughtful return to Canadian golden years, but while understanding that there are modern challenges, that there are, the game has changed in certain ways, but wanting to litigate and present a positive vision for the future with positive balance for what Canada can be again, coming out of a difficult few years of what was, in essence, government self-sabotage.
Well, I will put to you, Alexander, that I believe, and I have evidence to support that most Canadians, even though they voted for Trudeau 3 times, that most Canadians are of the view that Canada should still be a civil society, a stable society, a society where people come to Canada, immigrate to Canada, and they want to become Canadian, as opposed to having their tribal battles refought in the streets of Toronto. And so I would put to you that you don't need to convince Canadians of what you're talking about, but you need to convince politicians, because the politicians on all 3 levels in Canada, who, in my view, are massively screwing up. You talk about crime, you talk about immigration, you talk about values, you talk about family values. It's the politicians that we elect who are attempting to destroy those.
It's a good thing they're on our subscriber list, because I completely agree. Because if you talk to the average person now in the park, bump into on a walk, they're not doing the sort of song and dance of the last few years where they feel like they can't address aspects of what some would refer to as managed decline or degradation that they notice on a street level. They all have common concerns. Like I'm in a yuppie neighborhood in Vancouver where I imagine from like 2014 to 2023, you like could not have spoken your mind, or you would have been just kicked out of what was considered polite society. Now they're very reasonable concerns, public concerns about, hey, legalizing drugs was a terrible idea. No, duh. Or I'm concerned about the encroachments on my property rights because we've been giving inches and taking miles. Or like, maybe I want my kid to go to a school where the Canadian flag actually flies over it and we're not making them feel guilty every day. And so, of course, the politicians sadly have abdicated just so massively on this file. So it's about doing what we can to make sure that that message reaches them as often as possible. I'll carpet bomb their inboxes every day if I have to.
I'm glad you're saying that. I have to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about how you're carpet bombing and what with. Alexander Brown, we'll be right back. We're back with Alexander Brown. He is in Vancouver. He is the editor of Without Diminishment. And we heard in the last few minutes what your publication is all about and what you're hoping to achieve. And just before the break, you and I were in agreement that it's mainly in some places, UK, the Ottawa softies or the Laurentian elites, or I don't know what you call them in Vancouver, because you're the guy, or you're the province where you had so many officials, and during COVID, was it Bonnie Brown who was the minister of the top official of health? Bonnie Henry, who was all out for free drugs. And the city of Vancouver, I understand, has been decimated by a bunch of drug addicts.
It's hard to believe that didn't work, Stephen, and I certainly echo the sentiments that Adam Zivo's great reporting accomplished out here, which is that to you are we actually helping people? Is that actually compassionate? Is safe supply even safe? Are we reducing harm, or are we just extending it?
Well, but then
you
the
can
other
see
thing
what it
is,
did.
aside from those individuals, and I think it's clear now, by giving them free drugs or safe, clean hypos is not helping them at all. But what about the 99% of society, or 99.5,
Yep.
that are not drug addicts? I mean, that's what I
Yep.
saw in Vancouver, people sidestepping bodies on the ground.
I've heard a term recently while I was reading someone's work. I can't place their name, but it was the tyranny of the homeless. Which I'm not speaking about homeless people, the good old fashioned, charming bum who's down on his luck. But if you have 10 people in a public square, and one of them is a made schizophrenic from frequent drug use and being brought back to life, and I'm glad they're still with us. They're in charge. Everyone else is playing by their rules. It is inherently antisocial. It is inherently anti-civilizational that we continue to make these concessions for the tiniest percentage of people. We honestly do the same thing with our criminal justice system at this point, where a small percentage of super offenders are allowed to just run rampant through our cities like it's the Wild West. Sean Fraser would tell you it's not the Wild West. It is, and we just let them do it. When if you actually put a few people away, the people who are really struggling, or the people who are really lousy behind bars, like we'd be amazed at how quickly this gets better.
Okay, so you mentioned Sean Fraser, who was the Trudeau Minister of Immigration for a while. He messed up immigration. Now he's our Attorney General. I don't know why Carney keeps these people. Some people say that, observers say, well, he has no other choice because he needs their support, but there's no one else in the caucus who can do the job anyway.
Yeah.
But my point to you is, you've made it, in our last few minutes, liberal or conservative, and I put the issue to you, it shouldn't be partisan politics. What you're talking about, to my mind, is common sense. You and I have chatted about this. I mean, criminals go behind bars. Drug addicts, they need help, but they shouldn't be out in the street and give them more drugs. And so many social issues, they're just common sense answers. So if you call it conservative, then many Canadians will not accept it, will not support it.
I think you're right, and I suppose great notes for me as a professional. But I think my hope is in the work that we're all doing now in this kind of social license, common sense space, is that is that in the years ahead, coming back from some very difficult years, that these ideas and concepts are not considered conservative coded or liberal coded. It's right or wrong. Like I remember seeing a sign at the Freedom Convoy, which was attended by people on the left or the right, where the poster said like this isn't a left or right issue, it's up or down. And so it's encouraging to me that we have common cause on these files, that you are right that I should not be framing some of these issues from a conservative lens because it's just correct. And frankly, I don't care who gets the credit at this point. I'm not rooting for blue laundry. I just want good ideas. I want a return to the things that worked for our societies. I want families to be able to afford and then safely raise their kids in familiar Canadian cities from our childhood. And whether that is whoever gets the credit, in Parliament, like I could give less of a darn at this point.
That is such a Canadian thing to do, but you're absolutely wonderful to be saying that. And so, really, your campaign is as much against Liberals and NDP and Greens as it is with the Conservatives. So, congratulations for that.
Thank you, sir.
So, thanks for watching. We've been talking about reverse discrimination, and we've been talking about the fact that Canada can go back to some common sense values. Thanks for watching.